We scroll past winter alerts they lived through the last ice age about 115,000 to 11,700 years ago, and this video shows how that survival still shapes us. Many picture cavemen in caves. Evidence shows most life was in open camps with fire, clothing, and teamwork. You'll see how families tracked herds and timed the seasons. What made it possible? When people say cavemen, they often mean a single shadowy tribe carved in stone. The truth is quieter and more complex. During the last ice age, several kinds of humans shared parts of the same world. Neanderthals across large swaths of Eurasia, Denisovans in parts of Asia known mostly through their genes, and a few fossils and early Homo sapiens moving into new territories from farther south. These were not isolated curiosities. Bones and genomes both show that people met, exchanged genes, and sometimes lived close enough to borrow ideas and tools. The lives we imagine as cave-bound were one thread in a broader tapestry of places and practices. Caves and rock shelters preserve traces of life especially well. Charcoal, stone tools, and occasional ornaments survive under shelter where wind and rain do less harm. That preservation has taught us much of what we know, but it can mislead the imagination. Most daily life, the hard repeating work of cooking, scraping hides, flaking stone, stitching, and teaching the young, more often unfolded in open camps on plains, lake shores, and river bends. Picture a low fire sending warm light across a patch of snow, a seam of hide held taut while a needle bites a child watching and learning by the hearth's edge. Those outdoor places left more ephemeral traces, but they were where people kept their hands busy and their knowledge alive. Survival in cold places was practical and social. Fire, clothing, windbreaks, planned movement between richer and poorer places, and dependable sharing all mattered. In some regions, cave mouths offered safe, dry spots. Elsewhere, people built shelters or used landscape features to block wind. The Denisovans remain shadowy in bones, but vivid in DNA, their legacy visible in living people today. Neanderthals left stone, bone, and a record of care and complex behavior. How do we read these signals from the deep past and place them in time? The next step is to look at the tools researchers used to date camps, bones, and fires. Fire in the Ice Age was more than heat. It was a steady tool that stretched the day, sharpened work, and changed raw things into safer, more useful ones. Under low light, flint and sinew could be repaired, hides could be shaved and stitched, and food could be made softer and more digestible. Fire also helped make adhesives, the sticky mixtures that joined stone points to shafts, and it offered a moving circle of light that kept night predators and worries at bay. At some sites, thick deposits of ash mark repeated use. At others, dense layers of discarded bone and flint sit right beside hearths, telling a slow story of maintenance and daily habit. Evidence from caves and open sites shows hearths with thick ash in certain places carry the clear trace of long-lived fires. Light came in many shapes. People carried torches and made simple stone lamps that held tallow with a wick of lichen, moss, or conifer. Experimental visits into deep caves used pine torches impregnated with beeswax. One such trial followed a path 2 kilometers into a cave with several 80-centimeter pine torches and a supply of soft wax, and the journey lasted hours before the light ran out. Torches could be bright, but smoky tallow lamps were steady, but dim. So many little lights were needed to see colors in deep rock art. Smoke was part of the equation. Dental calculus at some sites preserves the chemical hint of smoke, and airflow studies at habitation levels suggest that smoke shaped where people sat, slept, and worked. In treeless plains, the lack of wood probably forced different choices of fuel, which in turn changed how and when fires were kept. Archaeology reads these choices like pages in a book. layered ash charcoal burned bone, and the arrangement of artifacts near a hearth show cleaning, relighting, and everyday repair. Where hearths are absent in cold settings, the absence itself is a clue, perhaps a lack of woody fuel or different strategies for warmth and light. Fire, then, was daily infrastructure, a managed resource that tied people to place and made shelter work and night possible. The next question is how those shelters formed around the light and smoke of the hearth. When you imagine Ice Age camps, think less of a single roast over a pit and more of steady, detailed work that stretched the day. Stones with smooth hollows and polished edges keep a slow record. Researchers have recovered grinding tools whose worn surfaces and trapped starch grains show deliberate plant processing. At places like Ohalo II, people ground wild cereals into flour, and elsewhere, a Gravettian grinding stone bears starches that suggest flour making long before farming. Even older tools from the Middle Stone Age carry microscopic plant residues, implying that soaking, charring, and grinding were learned ways to turn roots, seeds, and tubers into reliable calories. Alongside plants, the record points to a careful use of animal fat. Many butcher sites miss the grease-rich ends of large bones, which suggests people sought marrow and rendered grease by boiling or pulverizing, a work of patience that multiplied calories on lean days. Lipids are chemically stubborn; they survive where other molecules do not. Modern analysis of ancient pots finds traces of animal fats, plant oils, even cooked eggs, preserving a chemical echo of what was cooked. Those fats would have fed bodies in cold weather and may have been repurposed for fuel in lamps or for sealing hafts, though the exact uses often remain open to interpretation. Small, simple features sometimes hint that this was not only nightly improvisation but seasonal planning. Caches, specially prepared storage spots, and repeated use of the same camps suggest families anticipated harder months and tucked food away when they could. The low, regular sounds of grinding, the hiss of fat reducing at the rim of a pot, the careful folding of plant fibers into wraps. These were ordinary technologies of endurance. They worked hand in hand with sharing and care. Beside every hearth, there was a network of knowledge and help. Around those fires, with flour and grease and stories, people bound the present to the future. And the next question was how they organized that care across years. When people talk about peopling the Americas, they are describing not a single highway, but a patchwork of windows and trails that opened and closed with the weather. In some moments, the North offered a landward passage where ice retreated. At other times, long coastal shelves lay, exposed, a chain of rich shorelines and estuaries that could be walked and fished. Taste and smell matter here: the tang of seaweed and shellfish smoke on a low shoreline, the clean bite of wind across open steppe where herds paused. These were different worlds, and survival depended on reading the local map, following migrating herds, knowing where rivers thawed first, turning to shellfish and plants when big game was scarce. Climate and models shaped this picture. For a long span, the so-called inland corridor was blocked by glacial ice in the period from 30,000 to about 11,500 years ago. Much of it was not available. Even when parts of that route opened later, some reconstructions suggest there would have been too few animals to sustain people at once, shifting attention to the coast as a viable alternative. Sea level change also worked like a clock. Wide coastal shelves could be a boon when exposed, and a danger later as waters rose and those shelves vanished before people's eyes. The archaeological record, the distributions of camps and tools, and ecological reasoning together point to staged expansions, pulses of movement timed to local ecologies rather than a single, uninterrupted march. So survival in this late Ice Age world looked like careful timing and deep local knowledge, a choice of shelter, the right season for fish or migrating ungulates' fuels and hides, suited to a shoreline or a treeless plain. Small decisions mattered, where to light a hearth, when to push north, when to linger, and those decisions shaped which valleys and coasts were filled first. Ahead lies a colder map of Europe's refuges, and the camps that reformed as the glaciers eased there. The same rhythms of retreat and return quietly continued. In the cold reaches of the last glacial world, stone techniques were not simple progressions, but practical replies to moving animals, patchy woodlands, and long journeys between good raw material. The prepared core, what many call le Valois or similar methods, allowed makers to plan a shape into a core and remove flakes that were ready to work. Cores could be tortoise-shaped, discoid, or sliced in ways that let the napper produce several similar blanks in a row. Those blanks were efficient, less weight to carry, less time spent at a distant camp, and a higher chance of having the right edge when a carcass arrived at the hearth. Blades grew out of related thinking. From conical or carefully set cores, long thin blades could be struck in a nearly continuous rhythm, then further shaped and often hafted. Hafting turned a stone strip into a tool that could be lashed to bone, or wood, extending reach and lowering risk while hunting. In some places, even Neanderthals made long blades and complex flakes. Their traditions sometimes used stone hammers rather than bone, and in Northwest Europe, a blade-centered toolkit appears for a long stretch in the archaeological record. Small inserts and composite weapons answered another problem: travel costs and repair. A camp could carry many small stone pieces and replace a broken tip quickly rather than hauling large bifaces. Tiny worked pieces could be set into shafts with adhesives or bindings, creating projectiles that were light to carry and easy to resupply. These choices, prepared cores, blades, small inserts, were strategies for efficiency, versatility, and repairability, not a single ladder upward. Across continents, the same problems invited braided responses. Some groups favored long blades and a variety of burins and enscrapers. Others kept handaxes or moved toward fine, repeatable flakes. These paths crossed, overlapped, and sometimes vanished following prey, raw materials, and weather. As the climate pushed one last great chill into the world, people adjusted their toolkits and their diets, preparing, resharpening, and setting out again. How did those choices shape the ways people met the final cold snap that was to come? You tap the weather app and adjust the thermostat. The forecast is a line on a screen, and the cold is kept at bay by walls and wiring. Imagine instead a world where the weather arrived as immediate visible change: snow that did not melt away in summer, winds that blew fine dust across frozen soil, and winters that grew longer or shorter as the planet shifted its rhythms. The last glacial world was a rhythm of cold, dry episodes broken by milder, wetter breaths. That pattern meant people did not live in one locked, icy landscape, but in a shifting patchwork: plains, lakeshores, sheltered rock overhangs, places where food, wood, and warmth could be found at different seasons. The familiar idea of the solitary caveman is a misunderstanding. Caves preserve good records, but much of daily life played out in open-air camps where hearths burned, flakes were struck from stone, and garments were mended by lamplight. In open camps, smoke curled low and tools sang after dusk. How did they make the cold livable? The evidence suggests a suite of calm, practical answers: careful camp placement along the edges where animals gathered fuel and food, gathered as a team, and technologies small enough to carry and repair. Some groups lived on plains south of the great ice sheets, following herds and seasonal resources. Others waited out the harshest times in milder refuges. Fire was central, not only for warmth but for cooking light and work after dark, while clothing tents or windbreaks and shared tasks turned danger into habit. Hearth ash burned bones, tool wear, and site layout preserved choices for archaeologists to read. These layered traces let us see daily seasonal rhythms, planning and returns. Like a book with worn pages, camps keep the marks of repeated visits and small practical survival choices. These are the traces we read when we dig into ancient floors and bones. Next, we will look at the methods that let researchers date those camps' fires and the lives they contain. The phrase "last ice age" can make us picture an unbroken white world, but the real story is a rhythm of cold and brief returnings of warmth. Scientists frame this time in glacial, interglacial cycles. Long phases of ice expansion were punctuated by shorter warm events and abrupt chillings. Ice core records make that complexity plain, and researchers note a period of frequent change that made parts of the late Pleistocene one of high climatic upheaval. Within this shifting beat, there were windows when modern humans moved into new regions, and there was a cold peak, often called the last glacial maximum, that marked the height of ice and drought before the planet began a long, irregular warming. Across that sweep, landscapes did not stay uniformly frozen. Huge ice sheets pushed over parts of North America, Northern Europe, and high mountains, while other zones became exposed coastal plains or dry, wind-scoured steppe. Rivers and lakes swelled or contracted, forests retreated into pockets and steppe, tundra stretched where grazers gathered. These edge zones, shorelines drawn far out by lower seas, lake margins, and forest borders, became places where food and fuel overlapped and where people could make a living despite the cold. At a coastal camp, someone would boil shellfish and stitch skins beside the hearth, smoke curling softly. The world felt different from season to season and from place to place, rather than like a single frozen scene. Survival followed a pattern of movement and choice. Many groups retreated to refugia where firewood and food could still be found, timed their rounds to animal migrations and plant seasons, and kept skills that let them flex between hunting, gathering, and coastal foraging. As the climate lurched, people reused favored camps, tended hearths, and carried knowledge of shelter and clothing forward. Those adaptive habits did not vanish when the world warmed. They were the practical legacy that met the next chapter. Who tended those fires, kept watch on the edge of ice, and taught the young the routes to safety. When I say how we know, I mean the patient work that turned scattered ash, bones, and stones into a neighborhood map of ancient life. Some bones from tarry pits could not be dated until the petroleum was removed. Then they entered the same radiocarbon clock that helps place late ice age camps in time. But dates rarely stand alone. Layers matter. The stratified deposits of caves and rock shelters keep a record like pages in a book. Hearths, tool, napping floors, and middens sit in order, and careful excavation reads that order one thin slice at a time. Separating an authentic living floor from later disturbance is a matter of close inspection. Soil color, the orientation of flaked stone, microscopic traces of charcoal, and the chemistry of burned bone all tell different parts of the same story. Detailed analysis sometimes reveals wood preserved only as microscopic remnants or chemical signals. Other times, burnt bone is the clearest hearth ingredient. At sites with many hearths, places where dozens of fires accumulated, individual episodes of burning can be told apart, and in coastal caves, burnt shells and fish bones cluster around family-size hearths that were used for weeks or months at a time. A hearth smells of pine and smoke. Field evidence and laboratory science keep each other honest. Radiocarbon ages are weighed against the sequence recorded in the sediments and against the physical patterning of hearths and pits. where preserved repeated hearths, charred plant and animal remains, and the refuse of tool-making together confirm that people stayed, worked, and returned. In places without visible fireplaces, the absence may speak to scarce fuel rather than a lack of fire knowledge. The result is a layered picture, not a single moment, but repeated acts of living, tending flames, breaking bones, reheating pine cones on a hearth, each one anchored by both where it sits and how old it proves to be. With these cross-checks, we can begin to place camps within the larger rhythm of warming and cooling that shaped movement and choice. Beneath the things we touch every day, the smooth screen, the warm room, the deep past keeps an archive written in slow, natural ink. Ice sheets hold thin, layered pages. In Greenland and Antarctica, long columns of ice trap air and tiny impurities, and their chemical signals record swings of cold and warmth. Oxygen isotope curves and the chemistry of those layers show the zigzag of late ice age climate, the same swings reconstructed between about 110,0 and 10,0 years ago. In caves, mineral curtains called stalagmites and stalactites grow drop by drop. Their chemistry shifts when rains change. And in ancient sediments, grains of pollen are like fingerprints of past plants, forests, open grasslands, or scrub, each mix telling us about local moisture and temperature. Together, these records form an overlapping map of weather across time. Each archive spans different scales. Archaeologists read that map alongside camps and bones. Pollen tells which plants fed animals, and people cave minerals tell when rain was reliable enough to support springs, and stored water ice core signals give the big needle points of cold pulses or quick warmings. Other clues: tiny mammals that only live in limited climates or chemical markers in marine sediments join the conversation. When the climate signal shows a sudden warm pulse, roots open, coastal shelves rise or fall, and places once marginal become attractive for hunting or gathering. When the signal tips cold and dry, people cluster into refuges where water and fuel were steady. Imagine snow softening under tired boots, a cave mouth dripping like a distant clock, pollen dusted into a sleeping child's hair. These slow records let us place those quiet scenes within a rhythm of change, when to linger, when to move, where to make a hearth. How did people learn to read and follow the edges of that changing world? The next scene turns to those edges themselves, steppe and forest margins, lake shores and coasts, where life concentrated and choices mattered. The last ice world was not one unbroken white sheet, but a stitched landscape of edges. Wide treeless plains known as steppe, tundra opened into patches of woodland where trees held on, and those boundaries gathered life. These edges concentrated food, fuel, and shelter in small zones, where different habitats met so people and animals both returned to the same places. Herds of grazers, animals like caribou, musk ox, and lemmings, moved across grasslands, while elk and bison found niches nearby, creating animal mosaics that a hunter could read. Along the margins of ice, where glaciers calved or pressed down into valleys, camps watched over routes animals used. On coasts that met the cold sea, the shoreline could be dangerous and spare, places with few good landings. Yet they also concentrated food for people who learned the rhythm there. In these settings, archaeological evidence shows regional lifeways. Some groups, such as the Gravettians, survived across plains south of the ice by using portable stone armatures and strong social systems, while in Iberia and southwestern France, other traditions like the Solutrean appear in the record. People chose camps to ride these edges, not to hide from the cold, but to meet what the landscape offered. Winds carried the scent of herds, and the sound of distant hooves. Hearth smoke marked the meeting of shelter and view lines. You can imagine low flames and quiet conversation as people repaired tools and shared meat, while an elder pointed out a distant herd. Many hundreds of sites across Europe preserve thousands of artifacts, a quiet testimony to repeated strategies. Follow the animals, sit in places where wood, meat, and stone overlapped and move with the seasons. Coastal travel alongside vast ice margins seems unlikely and hazardous, a reminder that routes were chosen for safety as much as speed. Archaeological layers of reused hearths and repeated tool-making spots help map those calendars in stone and ash. How did people learn those calendars of movement and return? The next section follows those seasonal maps. How families timed their rounds, read the land, and passed the knowledge on. In the long, cold calendars lived in the body and in stories. People learned the year by watching where animals gathered and which valleys greened in summer. At places like Pinsevent and Verberie, the pattern in the bones and tools suggests people waited to intercept reindeer rather than tracking entire herds over long distances. Those spots were used when routes were reliable, and then abandoned when they changed. Other camps show shorter, more mobile use, an adaptive rhythm that reduced the risk of overdependence on a single herd. Jonzac's thick layer of reindeer bones, the so-called bone bed, preserves whole carcasses and repeated butchery nearby, and even the selective leaving of prime parts points to planning, not starvation. Summers of open tundra made travel easier, and lower seas opened land bridges that shifted where people could move. The result was a practical calendar of travel and rest, times to range wide, times to gather in shelter, and that calendar guided what to carry, what to leave, and when to return. It was learned in footsteps and bones, a living schedule passed down like a weathered map. Families carried that calendar as a living map. Stories, marks on shelter walls, and shared work passed knowledge from elders to children. Which cliffs held the best kill sites, which strand lines could be trusted in certain seasons, and where scarcity had been survived before. Cave images and communal ritual seemed to have tightened bonds, helping groups coordinate returns and share food across lean months. The map was read in tracks in frozen river crossings, and in the thin smoke trails that led back to known camps. These were not abstract directions, but sensed sounds and remembered weather, practical memory stitched into place. At dawn, smoke lay low and hides steamed, while elders traced routes in song. How else would a group know when to leave a sheltered hollow and when to trust a winter range? Ahead lies a quieter, ever-present technology that shaped those choices, fire, its ashes, and stones, showing how camps lasted through cold months. Caves and rock shelters show us one end of the spectrum, dark hollows, where smoke pooled and occasional hearths mark repeated winter visits, and sunny mouths where light and view made a damp cave feel like a room with a fire. Yet most living took place outside, in places where the sun could warm skins and tasks could be done by daylight. Excavations reveal open camps with organized hearths, many stone tools, and piles of bones, the working floors of everyday life. In some regions, people camped on dunes beside rivers and lakes, or on plains where herds passed. In others, they sheltered under overhanging rock. Where caves were deep and dry, they sometimes served for longer occupation. But archaeology also shows tents or huts in the open air, portable solutions that fit movement and changing resources, rather than a single fixed home. Picture a wind-scoured plain where a circle of skins and poles anchors a household. Smoke rims the opening while hands sort tools by the fire. Choice seems to have been practical and local. Shelter placement balanced weather, sightlines for watching game, and access to water and fuel. In exposed places, simple windbreaks and lightweight huts could have reduced biting wind while keeping the camp open to light and work. In the plains, small portable toolkits went with longer range mobility in sheltered river bends. Longer stays left clearer traces of hearths and craft. Neanderthal sites show intense use of caves, but little sign of constructed huts, while other groups left traces of repeated open-air encampments. The record suggests adaptation, not uniformity. People matched shelter form to need. They also made clothing that complemented those choices. Small hide-working tools and needles recovered from camps suggest tailored garments and fastenings that held warmth close. Shelters, clothes, and toolkits worked together like a woven blanket, each stitch, and not reinforcing survival across seasons. And if shelter solved the wind and the stone, what did they wear beside the fire to keep the cold at bay? By firelight, a hand quietly works the edge of a pelt until it yields scraping, softening, stretching. The smell of smoke, the flash of a flint, the thin thread passing again and again through tough skin. These are the quiet labors that turned raw hides into clothing you could trust. The archaeological record preserves hints of that work, bone needles and impressions of weaving beads and fastenings from burials, and the remains of shelters and tent fittings. Together they suggest people were not merely wrapping themselves in cloaks, but shaping fitted garments, hoods, mitts, layered shirts and leggings, and tailoring clothes for the most vulnerable among them, infants and small children. Tools made for hide processing appear in many cold contexts, and in the bitter millennia of the cold phases, archaeologists recover large numbers of long-edged scrapers used to prepare skins. Some groups seem to have relied on wrapped or draped hides fixed with thongs or sinews, while others developed sewing that used plant fibers or animal ligaments as thread. Leather thongs could be cut and used wet so that as they dried they shrank and gripped joints firmly. Antler bone and sinew provided handles, cords, and needle-like implements. The result was composite garments that combined the insulating properties of different furs and hides in deliberate ways. The work was domestic and repetitive. The same hands that butchered and cooked also stitched and mended, keeping seams tight against wind and wet. In some places, women fashioned tailored clothing for people of all ages, enabling layered systems much like modern climbers' outfits, but made from animal skins. These clothes joined hearths and shelters as basic infrastructure for cold survival, shaping how camps were organized and who could travel where. And the making of clothing relied on the same toolkit that made weapons and tools: stone flakes, bone points, glue, and cordage. So the story of survival moves naturally from stitched seams to sharper edges. How did the stone toolkits themselves change to meet those needs? When people speak of stone tools, they often picture a single shape or a single time. The deeper truth is quieter toolkits were different ways of solving the same problems. How to cut, scrape, pierce, hunt at a distance, repair in the field, and carry usefulness across long journeys. Archaeology shows not a straight ladder but a palette of strategies. In some places, makers refined their shaping of a core so that a single strike would release a carefully planned flake. Elsewhere they focused on long, narrow blades, and later still they produced very small, sharp blades, microliths, that could be fitted into handles or shafts. These shifts are not merely progress, but adaptations to mobility, resource limits, and the need to mend and reuse tools. Blade technology becomes prominent in many regions after the arrival of these new Upper Paleolithic traditions, and small blades were often reduced further into microliths that were set into wood or bone. Microliths are economical. A shaft could bear several tiny cutting edges, each easily replaced when dulled. Experimental and historical observation also shows how effective small stone armatures are when mounted as barbs or tips, sharp, light, and able to mutilate more than blunt metal in some cases. At the same time, careful study of cores and discarded flakes reminds us that what earlier excavators called waste often holds the secret of how a tool was made and repaired. The patterning of retouch and refitting reveals deliberate economies of raw material and time. These technological choices shaped everyday camp life: a hearth for reheating adhesive hands pressing sinew, and resin around a shaft, the click of fresh flakes landing in a pile, and the relief of replacing a tiny broken point instead of rebuilding an entire spear. In colder, open landscapes, or during the later pulse of microlithic lifeways, such flexibility mattered. Their craft quietly shaped survival. How then did those tiny stone edges become part of larger hunting systems, and how were they combined with shafts, adhesives, and distance? Small stone inserts and carefully shaped points changed the rules of living on a cold, open plain. Knappers made many small, sharp pieces and then set them into wooden shafts or handles. Tiny traces on the stone show not only cuts from use, but the fingerprint of manufacture, where a binding cord once held a point of film of resin or bitumen, even traces of ochre mixed into an adhesive. These recipes turned fragile flakes into resilient tools. A shaft with several inserts could flex, be repaired, and be reused. Many small pieces working together made a single weapon that could be remade at camp from the fragments on hand. Thin strips of sinew or plant fiber often bound them, while adhesives sealed gaps and reduced breakage. From a distance, those composite weapons rewrote risk. A thrown spear or a shaft tipped with multiple inserts could send force into a running animal while keeping the hunters back from hooves and teeth. Weapons are judged by range, accuracy, and striking power, and adding hafts, bindings, and adhesives improved all three. Some groups developed still more mechanically complex projectiles. Evidence suggests giving added reach and speed in open country. But distance was not always the answer. In thick brush by river bends, or during carefully staged drives into narrow defiles, hunters relied on stealth, long thrusting spears, and patient stalking. Different places demanded different choices, and most communities used more than one. The quiet work of making and maintaining these tools was part of daily life: scraping sinew, heating resin, tightening a cord, testing a point by hand. The smell of a warm adhesive, the light on a hafted edge, the small pile of spent inserts at a campfire are as much part of the story as the hunt itself. At dusk, someone might warm resin over embers, test a haft in the firelight, and lay spent flakes in a quiet heap. How those tools were used links directly to the ways people moved and shared food, which is the next larger pattern we can read in stone and bone. Small tasks knitted community routines. When the plain filled with hooves, a household's fate could turn in a single long day. Evidence suggests people watched the rhythms of migratory herds, reindeer and horse among the great gatherings on the northern plains, and placed themselves where animals must pass: river fords, narrow valleys, and the edges of frozen lakes. In those places, a quiet line of hunters could wait with spears or thrown points, a low light of fire, and the smell of grease keeping bodies warm through the watch. Sometimes the hunt took the shape of a sudden ambush. Sometimes it was a patient interception timed to a season when animals were thinned, slow, or funneled by the land. Communal hunts like these left marks in butchery patterns and clustered camps, and they fed more than one belly at a time. Other tactics worked with the landscape rather than against it. Groups could guide game into tight ground, natural pinch points where escape was difficult, or shadow herds for days until a chance opened. Tracking was often slow work, reading prints in mud, following droppings, and noting the way wind and snow masked sound. Some people moved through the world with knowledge so deep that elaborate planning became unnecessary. They returned to the same crossings and ambush spots because the animals returned too. There is also reason to think human groups shaped other animals' behavior in helpful ways, encouraging traits in wolves that made them better allies for guarding camps and aiding hunts. What made these strategies resilient was not only skill with weapons, but a culture of sharing. Meat brought back from a successful interception was distributed predictably, smoothing the feast-and-famine cycles of a cold world and creating a social safety net for the old, the young, and the injured. That predictable reciprocity strengthened group bonds and made risk manageable across seasons. And when the herds moved on, people turned to other foods, small catches, and coastal stands. So what fed them when the big animals were gone? They kept hope alive. The picture of Ice Age life that lingers in our imaginations is often a hunt for mammoth under a low sun. The archaeological record written in bones and shells tells a more varied story. Coastlines and lake shores preserve layers of fish, bones, seal, and sea bird remains, shells, and even depictions of auks in cave art. Eggshell fragments the size of a hen's egg have been found at sites like Pinseven, a small but vivid detail about what people gathered. Some researchers long insisted that certain human groups avoided small, elusive prey. Other evidence suggests they did not. Birds, fish, shellfish, and small mammals appear in many assemblages, showing that people trusted a wider menu when seasons or herds made large prey uncertain. At lakeside camps, the record grows into a calendar. Teeth from hunted animals preserve growth bands that let specialists tell whether an animal was taken in summer or winter. And from such clues, archaeologists infer that people return to the same places across seasons. Shell middens and concentrated bone layers mark repeated visits, and the mix of freshwater fish, waterfowl, and small mammals implies active year-round strategies rather than brief opportunistic strikes. Light at dusk, torches or fires, would have turned shallow waters and scrub into hunting ground where nets, traps, and quiet patience could turn small catches into steady calories. How did so many small returns add up to survival? By stacking modest captures with plants, rendered fats, and carefully tended hearths, communities smoothed lean times and stretched abundance. The traces of grinding and wear on tools hint that plant foods joined animals on the plate, while shells and tiny bones show steady harvests from water and shore. These choices, returning to familiar edges, harvesting broadly, and sharing the yield, kept families fed through cold years. Ahead lies the story of how plants, fats, and stored foods fit into this pattern, and how people turned gathered things into long-lasting sustenance. These practices demanded careful knowledge and patient skill, and were taught across generations. The bones speak in quiet ways. Some skeletons show enough healing that researchers read them as stories of care. Broken limbs, nit infections, lingered, sight faded in one eye, and yet the person lived on. A famous example shows head injuries crushing to one side of the body, blindness in at least one eye, infection, and partial paralysis, and that individual survived for several years. Those signs suggest sustained help. Food and water brought close shelter, kept warm, wounds tended. Around the hearth, a parent passed a bowl of warm broth to an injured companion, steam fogging the air and hands steadying the cup. This care passed skills along. In a cold world where a single bad fall could mean slow death, these long recoveries point to a social safety net that went beyond a single hunter's skill. Care was a practical, everyday technology. Camp spaces add another layer to the picture. The way sites are arranged and reused implies rhythms of return and repair. Places where hearths were tended, tools were reshaped, and stories were told. Child rearing is described as a major investment for the whole family group and practical choices. who stayed near the base, who moved with herds, were shaped by those needs. Women were capable hunters in theory, but childcare often kept people close to camp younger, and older group members carried knowledge in complementary ways. Older knowledge bearers held calendars of seasons, remembered safe routes, and guided the apprentices. Learning was hands-on, gentle, and social. Children did not learn only by watching. They practiced with real tasks, playing with simple tools, trying knots and wraps under patient eyes. Stories, songs, and shared work knitted memory to skill. Cooperation seen in other social species and patterns of site organization suggest a mix of role flexibility and deliberate teaching. If survival in the Ice Age required more than sharp points and warm hides, it was this quiet apprenticeship, care sharing and learning, that kept families alive. How did those lessons move beyond a single camp and stitch landscapes together? Along the cold edges of camps, things moved as surely as people did. Shells from the sea and teeth turned into necklaces appear in places far from any shore. Certain stones, chosen for color or ring when struck, turn up where that rock does not belong. These wandering materials mark more than commerce. A shell threaded into a cord gifted at a hearth announces a visit. A stone from another valley left beside a sleeping child speaks of ties that cross distance. Evidence suggests ornaments and distinctive raw materials were part of how groups kept in touch, shared knowledge, and offered help when weather or game failed. Like a message in a bottle, a bead carries a small, durable note of presence that can outlast a single life. The movement of objects and people carried stories as well as goods. Songs, hunting tips, and routes could travel with a bead or a tool. In many regions, items found beyond familiar lands, sometimes at distances greater than 60 kilometers, are more numerous, hinting at regular journeys or repeated meetings rather than one-off swaps. At the same time, researchers caution that walking long distances was part of daily life. A trip that looks distant on a map may have been a feasible round trip on foot. So a flint blade from across a ridge might mean a friend's visit as much as a long caravan. Some patterns suggest repeated meetings, timed with seasons rather than random loss or isolated trade. Imagine a winter evening. A thin shell glints in lamplight, hands warm from the hearth pass it over. A story about a new hunting ground begins, and the group learns which river ice is safest. These small exchanges braided populations together into networks of support and memory. Through objects, people signaled alliances, marriage ties, and obligations. Through speech, they passed calendars of animal movements and warnings of thin ice. How these social maps matched the land's darker signs. Tracks in snow, frozen, rivers, the timing of storms, shaped choices about where to travel and where to stay. Wind and weather were the maps. Where our phones show icons, people of the last cold times read the snow itself, which drifts kept the shape of yesterday's wind, which hollows filled with fresh powder, which rime marked a sudden thaw. Tracks, animal and human, told stories in slow motion. A fresh line of hooves could mark a herd's corridor. A set of shallow, staggered impressions might mean a cautious crossing. Listening was as important as looking. The thin, echoing crack of river ice, the hollow ring of thinner patches, the sudden muting when water ran below a frozen crust, all gave immediate useful information about danger and passage. Choices were careful arithmetic of energy and safety. A longer detour that met shelter and game could cost hours but save limbs and fat. A direct route across exposed ice could be faster but risk collapse or whiteout. Visibility mattered. Clear light offered distant watch. Storm-blown nights demanded tighter camps and smaller movements. These were not random trials, but learned judgments practiced until they became a shared memory of place. Evidence suggests people return to the same favorable lines across the landscape, and that routes carried warnings about hidden dangers as surely as they carried access to water and fuel. Those lines of memory, where snow hardened into a stable crust, where a river bent into shallows, where windbreaks sheltered fire and work, were traditions held by groups and taught to children at the edge of sleep. They smoothed risk into habits so travel could be both bold and cautious. How did they judge when ice would hold? The answer is embedded in choices written on the land, repeated crossings, seasonal calendars, and a slow accumulation of tested knowledge. Ahead lies a closer look at the people who lived by these judgments, and how Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens met the same cold, with different forms of skill and resilience. Soon we will trace particular camps' tools and small moments of everyday decision-making together. Stone keeps its own memory, the shapes of flakes, the scars on hearths, the battered limb bones of large grazers. Neanderthal camps show that people designed tools with skill and variety, using prepared flake methods, alongside other techniques, so they could cut, scrape, and work hides and meat. Fire was more than a luxury. It gave light for repair, and sewing it changed textures and calories in food, and it marked places to gather through long nights. On cold plains, hunts targeted big herbivores, herds that moved with the seasons, and the bone refuse left at sites records repeated organized butchery. You can almost hear the snap of frozen twigs, see sparks under a low sky, and feel the shared warmth where meat was divided and knowledge was handed on. Smoke braided the night air like a low ribbon carrying stories of technique, repair, kinship, and small lessons that moved from hearth to hearth. These lifeways were not isolated. The genetic trace of Neanderthals lives on within modern humans, a reminder that people met and mixed as they moved across the same landscapes. Archaeology shows overlaps in time and place, and many researchers argue that interactions ranged from exchange to competition. Sometimes stone tool traditions changed where groups met, sometimes populations shifted as habitats altered. The picture is one of connection and entanglement, not simple replacement. Why Neanderthals vanish from the late Pleistocene record is still debated. Explanations in the field range from introduced disease to pressures from expanding modern human populations, and a habitat change that reduced suitable woodland for some groups. Demography, climate variability, and contact all likely played parts, and different regions may tell different stories. What is clear is that their skills, hunting at scale, managing fire, and making complex tools, were effective for long spans. As we turn toward the next chapter, we will follow the arrivals of early Homo sapiens and ask what new rhythms and innovations layered onto these old, resilient lifeways. When modern people moved into Eurasia during the span scholars call MIS 3, roughly 60,000 to 24,000 years ago, they did not arrive as a single tide, but as small mobile parties threading familiar routes, down river valleys, along then flowing Saharan watercourses, and across a Red Sea whose lower level made crossings easier. In places such as the Mount Carmel area, new groups layered onto long-used landscapes. Campsites took on new accents, some retained deep local practices, while others welcomed foreign objects and ideas. On a windswept plain, a blade was struck from a core, and a thin, long flake flashed in the firelight. Elsewhere, a pendant was polished and threaded, a small, bright thing that tied one body to another across distance. A fire's glow kept faces known. Evidence suggests blades and related toolkits became important across wide areas, while ornaments and long-distance connections increased the social reach of bands. Clothing and footwear also show regional responses to cold in northern China. The skeletons hint at increased protection such as shoes by around 40,000 years ago. People tuned their toolkits, clothing, and camp patterns to the ground they knew. River floodplains favored broad spectrum. Gathering open plains favored distance hunting, and coasts or lakes called for different skills. How did these choices spread? Objects and people moved together. Stones, shells, and ornaments carried stories and obligations between groups, creating networks that could be drawn on when weather or prey failed. Layering is the right word. Populations arriving over time did not simply replace those already present, they overlapped, borrowed, and sometimes vanished. In parts of Europe, long-lived traditions like the Gravettian end abruptly as climate tightens, a reminder that choices mattered within limits. Across the vast east and west of Eurasia, local twists shaped shared innovations, blade-based strategies, decorated bodies, and wider social ties. Beyond these corridors toward the east, other human stories wait in bones and stone. There, we will follow the next traces of adaptation and contact. Most of what we know about the Denisovans comes not from whole skeletons, but from their smallest traces, ancient DNA threads pulled from old bones, and a thin fossil record preserved in a single cave. Yet those faint marks travel far. Genetic signatures linked to that Eastern lineage appear in people today, especially in parts of Melanesia and New Guinea, where a few percent of some genomes carry that older inheritance. Other signals map westward and northward into the high mountains of the Altai, and even into parts of western Eurasia, suggesting a wider patchy presence than the fragmentary bones alone would show. Low levels of mixing with incoming Homo sapiens were apparently common, leaving a muted but persistent echo in living peoples even today. Across Asia, the same problem. Cold nights, thin air, long distances between resources favored similar solutions, even when different groups worked them out separately. Where tundra open, people made tools and clothing for mobility and repair. Where high plateaus exposed camps to wind, hearths and windbreaks gathered smoke and warmth into tight circles. Along coasts and rivers, shoreline seasons invited varied diets and flexible toolkits. The archaeology of the region shows repeated choices: lighter, maintainable gear for travel, composite implements to extend reach, and camp layouts that kept fire, food preparation, and craft close to the living circle. Interbreeding events have a time depth as well. Genetic work points to encounters between Denisovan-related populations and early Homo sapiens during the long final chapters of the Pleistocene, leaving a small but measurable legacy. That legacy is uneven, rich in some island and coastal peoples, scarce or absent in parts of mainland Asia. Stone and Gene thus tell complementary stories of local innovations, of long journeys, and of meetings that mattered biologically and culturally. As these eastern threads pull across mountains and seas, they meet an entirely different set of challenges farther south and west. How did the story change where ice was not the dominant actor, but shifting rains and refuges were? Africa was not draped beneath the great ice sheets that sat over northern continents. Instead, the last ice age arrived in rhythms of rain and drought, periods when the Sahara sometimes greened with lakes and river systems, and other times drifted into desert. High places like the Ruwenzori carried local glaciers, and records from East African lakes show water levels and climates shifting alongside wider changes. These moves in water and wind reshaped where wood, game, and edible plants could be found, turning once familiar routes into hard choices and opening others that had been hidden when the rains returned. Shifts in monsoons and rainfall pushed rivers and lakes to swell or shrink, so people had to follow the water's pulse across the land. In that shifting, whirled pockets of steadiness. refugia beside coasts, great lakes, and persistent river corridors, likely anchored people and their traditions. Where water lingered, hearths could be kept burning, food could be gathered more reliably, and camps were reused through generations. You can imagine the sharp salt on a coastal breeze, the wet slap of fish hauled ashore, and the steady ring of tools being resharpened. By lamplight, these places held enough fuel and food to let families teach young ones the seasons and the skills that mattered most. By an evening lake, a parent might guide a child in flaking a stone, while smoke carried the smell of wet reeds. Evidence suggests people retreated to such nodes when conditions tightened, then spread outward again as rains and shorelines shifted. Continuity came from those returns. Ornaments, pigments, and shaped points carried meanings and methods across time and distance. Even when broad regions thinned, communities preserved ways of making, sharing, and remembering. Those rhythms of retreat and return knitted social memory across generations, storing techniques and meanings in travel routes and objects. The record points to movement and resilience, not disappearance, a braided story of placekeeping, repair, and slow innovation. As Africa held its own mosaic of wet and dry coast and lake, the next chapter takes us to lower seas and changing monsoons, where shorelines and islands would create other pathways and refuges. Where the ocean fell away, the map of the world looked different. Shallow shelves became land. Islands that today seem separate were joined into wider shorelines, and in the far south, Tasmania, Australia, and New Guinea were part of a single larger land. That joined coastline created long, continuous beaches and river corridors people could follow for long stretches. Dense jungle still held many islands, so travel meant moving through thick green, and at times crossing stretches of open water that could be tens of miles across. Along these widening coasts, tidal flats, estuaries, and lagoons gathered fish, shellfish, and water birds. The shore acted like a ribbon of food and shelter, a place where forest and sea met, and where people could spread their tasks between wood and water. Monsoon rhythm set a steady, if changeable, beat to the year. Rain pushed animals and plants into predictable runs and retreats, while leaner spells invited risk and invention. In some parts of the region, forests stayed largely intact even as global climates shifted, but the strength and timing of rains could change, so camps and routes had to be flexible. People learned seasonal calendars: when shellfish fattened, when river mouths opened for fish, when inland fruits ripened. Memory of a place mattered as much as maps made of stone. Survival here was a balance of skills and tools shaped to humidity and sudden change. Light boats or simple rafts likely meant short crossings. Knives, scrapers, and small tools served both forest hides and fish processing. Camps gave way to shorelines when waters dropped, and to sheltered river bends when rains rose. Smoke and the smell of cooking mingled with wet wood and sea salt. At dusk, children and elders sat by low fires, the day's catch steaming on flat stones while night insects rose. As sea levels rose again, connections thinned, isolating groups and reshaping routes. An ebb and flow of people as much as water. Farther north, different pressures and plains set other rules for movement and life. The northern plains were not a frozen silence, but a working, windswept landscape where mobility, warm clothing, and a reliable fire were ordinary tools of survival. In open country, people could not rely on caves along the Siberia, Beringia, Alaska route. There are few natural shelters, and the archaeological record shows sites left in the open with hearths and the remains of meals. Evidence suggests groups favored small, portable stone armatures, light, repairable pieces that could be carried, replaced, or hafted to shafts, because weight and flexibility mattered when travel and weather were constant concerns. Clothing and other cold adaptations were part of that technology shaping how people moved, and how long they could stay on the plains at the edge of habitability. Needles and hide working likely turned skins into fitted garments and sealed joints at sleeves and hoods, so hands could still work and faces be sheltered. Surveys in eastern Beringia have revealed many buried camps in Les with intact scatters of artifacts, fireplaces, and butchered bones. These traces speak of repeated occupation, careful fire maintenance, and mobile logistics camps that could be packed, shifted, and re-established as herds moved or ice advanced and retreated. Hearths also processed fats and small game, leaving layered deposits that show planning and seasonal return. At the same time, the broad picture of low sea levels stitched landmasses together. Beringia linked Siberia and Alaska, opening a wide, cold gateway rather than a narrow coastal road. Some ideas about long voyages beside calving ice walls now seem extremely far-fetched. The practical, dependable solutions people used on the steppe, tundra, were plausibly more important. Picture a small circle of light against a vast dark smoke, rising skins dried and stitched sparks flaring as a tool is reshaped. Stone keeps its own memory, hearth ash marks time. The campsite is a compact workshop, and a warm room folded into the landscape, a kit that could be packed and set down again like a field laboratory. These quiet routines, mobility, layered clothing, and dependable fire coupled with small portable tools and flexible camp plans, made life at the northern edge possible. How those strategies then translated into the first movements into the Americas is the next part of the story. When ice pushed down from the north, people did not vanish so much as gather where the country still offered wood, water, and game. The record shows that the coldest years around the last glacial maximum forced populations into milder refuges, plains and coastal margins where fuel and foodstuffs could still be found, and pockets south of the great ice sheets where grasslands and grazers persisted. Sea level had dropped, exposing broad, often barren coastal plains. Elsewhere, the world became a patchwork of steppe, tundra, wind-blown dust, and thin woodlands. In those places, small mobile toolkits and social ties kept people moving with resources rather than fixed to a single shelter. Each refuge offered a different mix of trees, water, and stone shaping daily routines. As climates eased, people swept back across the emptied ground, occupying river corridors, lake shores, and former hunting routes. Camps that archaeologists uncover from these spans are rarely chaotic. Hearths sit at the heart of living spaces, flaking stations shine with scattered chips where stone points were shaped, and middens mark where food and debris were set aside. These organized zones hint at steady routines, someone tending the fire and lamps, others fashioning tools, and others preparing hides or cooking the day's meat. The presence of small portable armatures in some traditions speaks to solutions tuned for mobility and repair, a practical division of labor across tasks and seasons. Life in a refuge had a rhythm the landscape enforced. Maps of season and movement learned by memory, the timing of herds, the feel of a wind that brings snow. Camps were places of work and care, repeated visits, and shared knowledge that kept bodies warm and children learning. A morning could smell of boiling fat and ring of struck stone. From the glow of a hearth to the ring of a flint struck on anvil, these small, ordinary acts sustained communities through cold centuries. How those daily rhythms braided into songs, images, and shared meanings is the quieter story that follows. Deep in caves and along sheltered rock faces, people left images and carved objects that the record still holds. Paintings and engravings often show animals and shapes placed with care, occasional sculptures, and isolated marks on open rocks or riverbanks suggest the same attention. The evidence suggests these works were more than decoration. They carried meaning beyond their form, markers of group identity touchstones for memory, perhaps protective signs or records of place. Musical instruments and simple sound makers also appear in the archaeological story, and the structure of musical practice seems to follow different rules than language. Together, images, ornaments, and sound created shared symbols and a common soundscape. Unlike spoken sentences, musical patterns rely on repetition, rhythm, and pitch to cue memory, and feeling often without fixed words. Ornaments and repeated visual motifs work the same way, providing quick cues about who made them and why. Like a stitched map of belonging, these marks and melodies could be read at a glance or hummed across a dark night. Archaeology cannot hear the songs now, but instruments, and where patterns tell us people performed and listened together. That shared world would have helped bind people across age and distance, giving a steady frame for teaching and remembering in a time when root seasons and hunting grounds shifted with the climate. In the glow of a hearth, pigment smudged on a palm, a carved bead warmed between fingers, a low rhythm filled a long night. These are the small scenes the evidence invites us to imagine. We can hear the rasp of a drilled hole, the soft tap of a pebble, the breath across a bone flute. Such practices likely steadied learning children could be shown, where to return elders could sing calendars of herd movements and groups could rehearse rules for sharing and safety. Short songs and images often served concrete tasks, marking caches, signaling seasonal camps, or timing migrations with simple chants. The art and music do not explain every choice, but they point to a social technology of memory and belonging that crossed generations. From these quiet gatherings, practical knowledge could be handed on as surely as a stitched seam or a repaired spear. Next, we turn to the very light that made such work possible. Night belonged to the flames. Cooking was not simply a way to make food warm. Evidence suggests it eased digestion, increased nutritional returns, and made some foods safer to eat. Archaeologists read traces of heat on bones, patterns where flesh sheltered some surfaces while exposed bone burned more. That point to roasting beside a hearth. Fireplaces appear clearly in the record at many Neanderthal and early modern sites in the later stages of the Ice Age, while some camps lack obvious hearths, perhaps because local fuels were scarce, or because fire played a different role. For communities that kept it, the hearth became a kind of slow machine, heat to render fat, to soften plants, to make tough meat more yielding. Around such fires, people shared food and knowledge. Scholars have argued that cooking and the habit of gathering at a hearth helped bind cooperation into daily life. Smoke shaped where people put the fire and how they arranged the camp. Experiments with torches and lamps show that portable light worked. Pine torches give bright flame but thick resinous smoke, and that managing that smoke mattered when people moved deep into caves or set up open-air camps. The smell and sight of smoke could reveal a cook's location to visitors, and neighbors and hearths were often placed where smoke could disperse. After dark, the glow of embers allowed close, precise work, sewing hides with thread and sinew, repairing hafted points, trimming tools, and telling the stories that carried place knowledge across generations. By concentrating food preparation, hearths reduced daily labor and freed time for crafts, mending, and teaching. At dusk, someone turned a spit, while children leaned into the embers, learning tools and stories. Even when archaeologists do not find clear hearths, the routine of night work and shared light is a quiet explanation for how families kept themselves fed, clothed, and remembered, an ordinary technology that made survival social. How did these habits shape bodies and diets? The next chapter listens to bones and teeth for the answer. When we ask how people actually fed their bodies through the last cold, the answer comes not from a single object, but from a chorus of small traces. The chemistry locked in bone collagen keeps a long-lived diary. Carbon ratios hint at the kinds of plants in a diet, and nitrogen ratios tend to climb as you move up the food chain. Tiny scratches on tooth enamel record what a mouth ground, and sliced microscopic particles trapped in dental calculus preserve fragments of plants and other foods. A child's molar might hold pollen from a late summer berry. Sliced teeth show fine seasonal bands in the cementum, a record of lean and plenty that overlays a lifetime. Taken together, these clues let researchers read diet not only in broad strokes, but season by season. The pattern that emerges is mixed and practical rather than pure. In some places and times, the isotope signal and the stones on site speak of people acting as top predators, processing large carcasses with systematic methods and cooperation. In other camps, isotopes underplay the plant work we see in calculus and tooth, where reminding us that meat-heavy signals do not mean an absence of plants. Strict carnivory is not a stable long-term solution for nursing bodies and pregnant people, so groups balanced fats and flesh with roots, seeds, tubers, and smaller prey where available. Broad-spectrum foraging, birds, fish, shellfish, plants, and small mammals, often filled seasonal gaps and buffered hard winters. Bones and teeth also keep a record of cost and care. Cut marks and broken marrow bones speak of butchery, and shared food cementum stripes mark periods of stress and recovery. Where skeletons show healed trauma, they point to ongoing care and social support. Food was a seasonal map, a set of learned routes and tasks that tied families to particular places and calendars. Bones tell us about calories and craft. What remains is an invitation to look next at injury, infection, and the quiet work of healing in cold places. Bones keep an honest record of hardship and care. On ancient skeletons, we read repeated strain-healed breaks, and the subtle scars left when infection brushed a growing child's spine. The bones do not tell stories in full sentences, but they show that injuries happened, and that many people lived long enough afterwards to heal. Pathogens carried from animals, plants, and soil could move through close communities, yet the pattern of disease in the late Ice Age does not look the same as the illnesses that came later with farming. At some sites, a child known in the record bears traces of spinal infection. At another, a sample of many arm and leg bones shows surprisingly few severe breaks, while older individuals exhibit the slow inequality of wear that comes with a hard life. In one well-studied burial group, many people carry signs of interrupted growth infections and other pathologies. One skull bears multiple injuries likely received in violence. These marks give a sober view. Danger was real, but survival was common enough to leave healed bones behind. What matters is what happened around those bones. Evidence suggests groups made space for the injured, feeding them, keeping them warm, stitching hides, and tending wounds beside the hearth. Some writers imagine song and gentle rhythm as a way to soothe, and a steady work for those who could not yet walk far. Care may have arisen from affection, utility, or both. Picture a low chant while hands stitch torn skin, embers throwing slow light. These small practices become part of larger survival strategies. The archaeological silence about many illnesses leaves room for uncertainty, but the pattern that survives points to cooperation as a practical medicine. Small remedies, shared knowledge of when to move or stay, and steady attention could turn a setback into recovery. As we move to thresholds of technology and planning, imagine a night by the fire, a broken arm wrapped, a flint edge repaired, and a group holding time together until the next season. When the climate hiccuped in that final cold breath before the Holocene, the change arrived like a new season writ large. Ocean circulation faltered, and for about 1,000 years much of northern Europe grew colder and drier. The event we call the Younger Dryas is placed in the record between roughly 11,500 and 10,600 BCE. Grasslands and steppes stretched where forests once stood, and ice edges pushed southward. In that vast wind-shaped landscape, people relied on toolkits designed for movement and repair. Archaeological traces show groups using small portable stone armatures, tiny points and inserts that could be carried, replaced, and hafted to shafts. Across the plains south of the ice sheets, from Italy into the Eastern European lowlands, these lighter, more flexible tool systems accompanied organized camp routines, while in the far west different traditions like the Solutrean marked local solutions to the same cold. They managed fuel and gear for long moves, favoring items that could be repaired on the trail, and made movement reliable and predictable. The record suggests survival was less about static shelters and more about timing and choice. Camps shifted with seasons, hearths were kept ready for night work, and groups returned to familiar hunting grounds when herds or fish ran in predictable cycles. Diets broadened where necessary: grassland, resources, small animals, and whatever the local water or shorelines offered helped steady calories through thin months. Exchange networks and social ties smoothed shortfalls, and small tools let people mend, patch, and remake what they needed along the way. By night, a single hearth could warm wrapped bodies. Smoke sent the air and steady hands while sharpening points. Stone keeps its own memory. Those tiny fragments tell of families learning when to move, when to wait, and how to live with sudden cold. A quiet practice that prepared them for the warming to come. Such small, steady habits added up across seasons and generations. What choices then shaped the first steps into the new, warmer world? When we ask how people actually survived the last ice age, some of the clearest debates are quietly practical. One question is about weapons. When and where did long-range, complex projectiles become common, and who had them first? Evidence from Africa suggests complex projectile systems were in use well before a late Pleistocene boundary. Some finds even push those origins earlier than once thought, while many Neanderthal sites do not show the same association with those weapons. Did distant hunting change the balance between groups, or were other factors more important? Researchers do not treat this as a single silver bullet. They weigh stone tools, hafting, traces, animal bone patterns, and site context together before drawing conclusions. In practice, this careful weighing makes most interpretations intentionally modest and provisional. A second live question is how permanent were people's homes? The record holds both quick hunting camps and large, long-used base camps. Pinsevent reads like a folded season of hearth's tools and discarded bones. Mesurich shows houses made from mammoth bones, carefully arranged, and reused. An engraving from Moly del Salt has been read as a small cluster of dome huts. These examples show variation. Some places function like villages or information centers, others were temporary stations on a seasonal map. Archaeologists read hearth layers, tools scatter, and repeated building episodes to tell whether a place was returned to year after year or occupied briefly. Finally, why did some lineages fade while others endured? The disappearance of Neanderthals is treated as a knot of causes: climatic swings that reshaped habitats, returning populations of Homo sapiens. In some regions, differences in toolkit and subsistence, and local population stress. There are hints of contact and of shared or borrowed technologies in late toolkits, which makes a single explanation unlikely. Across these debates the practice is steady combined stones and bones, art and hearths, regional patterns and timings, and only then let a cautious answer take shape. Next we turn to the tools researchers use to read those traces. Under cold lab lights, fragments of bone and flakes of stone keep a quiet record that ordinary sight cannot read. Ancient DNA has opened a direct line to the biology of people who lived through the last ice age, and where DNA cannot survive, proteins and amino acids sometimes can. Scientists use measures such as amino acid racemization to judge how dry a bone's interior has remained, and that dryness can protect molecules against decay. There are surprising places where molecules endure. Bones from waterlogged peats have yielded DNA, and permafrost can hold genetic material remarkably well. Sequencing approaches, once experimental, now let researchers pull whole swathes of information from tiny extracts, and the study of parasites, DNA, or of long-lasting proteins offers parallel ways to read the past when human tissue itself is rare. In the field you smell cold earth and peat. In the lab you listen to machines translating those faint molecular memories into coherent patterns. A racemization curve or a protein sequence is like faded ink on a page. The marks are faint, but careful study can still make out the sentence. Stone keeps its own memory, and so do molecules. Sediments around hearths, floors, and shorelines carry a different kind of evidence. Grass fragments and microscopic particles trapped in layers can be dated and placed in sequence, as when plant remains from an ice-preserved context were dated in a lab. Careful excavation and stratigraphy separate living floors from later disturbance, and direct dating of tiny finds helps cross-check the story. Sediment layers stack like pages in a slow book, each thin deposit adding a seasonal entry to a long ledger. Together, molecular results and sediment records are reshaping long-held timelines and adding nuance to what we thought we knew about Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens. Old collections are being re-examined with these tools, and fresh finds revealed by melting ice are joining the conversation. How do those molecules and buried layers reach forward into the lives and habits we carry today? The habits that steadied people through the cold were often quiet, practical things that left little drama but a deep imprint. Evidence suggests social life itself shaped our ability to speak and share knowledge. The pressures of living closely together favored better vocal communication and richer exchange of experience. Around a hearth under smoke and low light, people mended hides, tuned points, and taught children when to follow a herd or where roots hid beneath frozen ground. Adaptability mattered more than raw strength. Researchers note that flexible learning and careful memory of seasons and roots were central to daily safety. That steady work of passing on skills looked less like heroic feats and more like patient apprenticeship. By repeating small tasks and stories, communities kept shared calendars and tools reliable across seasons and generations through many winters and migrations. Those human habits sit beside deeper traces written into our bodies. Genetic studies show that a small fraction of Neanderthal DNA persists in many of us, an enduring echo of meetings long ago. Researchers have cataloged a set of genetic changes that distinguish modern humans from some other archaic groups. At the same time, scholars warn that genes are only one thread in a larger tapestry. Human groups have been fluid, ideas travel far, and cultural practices reshape lives rapidly. Extracting genetic information has become possible in recent research, but interpreting what particular variants do for people today remains cautious work. What lingers most powerfully is not a single gene, but the social toolkit cooperation, predictable sharing, and storytelling that encodes calendars, routes, and recipes for clothing and shelter. Ice Age art, music, and ornament making appear to have reinforced group identity and memory, helping groups survive lean winters and shifting landscapes. In that long ledger of survival, care for the injured and the patient teaching of children are legacies we carry. The habit of visiting far places for stone or shell also endures. How do those quiet lessons from firelight and snowy tracks light our way now? Night in the Ice Age was not pure silence or endless white. Hearth smoke curled against low clouds, the scrape of hide sewing, and the tap of flint tools punctuated the long dark, and a handful of lamps threw a small pool of light over careful hands. Where seas lay far out and grassland stretched cold and wide, people learned to read the edges, the places where herds gathered, where rivers thinned to safe crossings, where wind sought shelter. Evidence suggests these were not random moves, but a remembered map of seasons, when to wait, when to follow, when to fall back to milder ground. Even in the deepest cold, in the span that included the last great glacial maximum, people kept those practices alive and passed them along. By lamplight, a parent showed a child how to seam hides with bone needles, quietly teaching survival as story and skill. That taught map combined memory of winds, animal rhythms, and subtle landscape cues. These quiet lessons were practical, passed as habit rather than lecture. Survival was never only about tools. It was about seams. The seams between hunters and cooks' children, and elders' relatives and visiting neighbors. Small portable technologies and careful clothing met immediate needs, while larger networks spread risk. Distinctive stones and ornaments moved across distant stories, and shared knowledge crossed camps. The record of healed bones and repeated hearths shows care and planning as central strategies. When climates jumped, a sudden cold pulse here, a brief warmth there, groups adjusted mobility, diversified foods, and leaned on one another rather than on single fixes. Their ingenuity was practical and steady rather than heroic. The lesson they leave is quiet but clear. People survived by reading landscapes, sharing well, and adapting together. In a world where climates shifted and coasts redrew themselves, calm ingenuity and mutual care kept lives going. If we listen to that long, slow practice of attention and cooperation, what pathways might it open for us now?